Okay, so it's 4 o'clock p.m. Eastern Time, so we're going to get started. Welcome to our webinar, Exploring Participatory Research, Part 1, Participatory Plant Breeding. My name is Steph Hughes, and I'm a Regional Coordinator in the Atlantic Provinces for the Bauta Family Initiative on Canadian Seed Security. As some of you may know from past webinars or from working with us in the field, ours is a program dedicated to increasing the quality, quantity, and diversity of ecological seed grown across Canada. A big part of our work is delivering training to seed producers, and these webinars are an integral part of that because they allow us to bring together our sometimes isolated seed communities to share the knowledge of experts and practitioners across the country and continent. So thanks very much for joining us. It means a lot to us that you are giving your time to this webinar. Today's webinar is the first in our new series, Seed Systems Broadening Our Knowledge. This year, our webinars will explore a range of topics that go beyond seed production into all aspects of the seed system. This year's series will include on-farm variety trialing, pest and disease solutions, approaches to seed banks and libraries, and finally, the People's Choice webinar. So this last one should be a fun experiment. It will happen sometime in the fall, and we'll be looking to you for ideas about what issue we should explore or what presenters we should engage. If you've already got some ideas on that, I say go for it. You can email me anytime at seed@acornorganic.org. That's my email address on your screen now. Otherwise, our full webinar schedule will be posted online soon at seedsecurity.ca. For those of you who are still catching up on last year's webinars, all those recordings are still available on the video page of our website, and those URLs are on your screen now. So a few technical details before we get started. If you're having any trouble hearing us, you may want to adjust your speakers. You can do that both with the speaker icon at the top of your screen or through your actual physical computer and speaker settings at home. If you're still having trouble with the audio, getting the audio through your computer, you have the option of dialing into our phone line. The number and code are on the screen now and in the chat window at the bottom right corner of your screen. So if you do call in on the phone line, please remember to mute your line by pressing *6. This helps us avoid unnecessary disturbance on the line. So today we'll hear from 3 presenters who will give us some insight about what is meant by participatory research and participatory plant breeding specifically, and why it's a form of research that really matters. We'll get the benefit of 3 perspectives today. We'll hear about PPB in Honduras from Sally Humphreys, PPB on the farm from Matthew Weens, and finally PPB across Canada from Ann Kirk. We'll have some time for Q&A after Matthew's presentation for both Matthew and Sally, who may need to leave us a little bit early, and we'll also reserve 10 minutes for questions at the end of Ann's presentation. So for the Q&A, you can ask your questions by typing into the chat pod on the bottom right corner of your screen, and I'll pull from the pool of questions and ask them to our presenters. So without further delay, we'll begin with Sally Humphreys, Professor in Sociology and Anthropology at the University of Guelph and Director of the International Development Studies program there. Prior to her arrival at Guelph in 1994, she worked at the International Center for Tropical Agriculture, where she was in charge of setting up a program of farmer participatory research in Honduras. It is this program, which she started with a Honduran associate in 1993, that is today a leader in participatory plant breeding. So thanks very much, Sally, for being here. That is your presentation that is loaded now.
Great. Okay. Thank you very much for the introduction. So what I'm going to talk about today is the work we've done of linking poor farmers to the formal research sector, and what can we take from that, and its relevance for Canada. This is not my work. This is also the work of, This is the work of the Foundation for Participatory Research with Honduran Farmers, FIPA, and so a shared presentation. So as mentioned, this started when I was at the International Center for Tropical Agriculture, and the concern at that time was the amount of deforestation in Central America. As you can see from the slides, forests disappearing through slash and burn agriculture, and I was sent to set up a program of farmer participatory research that might address this. And we started 22 years ago. This is the first farmer research team we set up, and this is the first experiment that we set up. As you can see, farmers planted straight down the hillside, so not a good indication of local indigenous knowledge. And so we set about teaching farmers to conduct research. And what we learned very early on was how pervasive food insecurity was in the hillsides. So the experiments that we taught farmers to do, which involved using a local check against different varieties to see if local materials were part of this food insecurity problem in the hillsides. And what we learned very early on was that when we started testing local materials against formal sector materials, in fact, the formal sector materials were very poor, much worse than the local materials. We also learned that there was a lot of skepticism on the part of scientists towards participatory research 22 years ago. So now I'm going to jump forward to 22 years to today. And now there are, we have 119 farmer research teams that have been set up in Honduras. These are supported by the Foundation for Participatory Research with Honduran farmers. This is the NGO that grew out of the pilot project that I helped set up, and a sister NGO, which is the Program for Rural Reconstruction. And both have been supported for many years by Canadian charities, USC Canada and World Accord, respectively. So PPB is now being practiced widely by farmer researchers supported by these two NGOs. And note the incredible sort of conservation planting across the hillsides in comparison to that first experiment 22 years ago. 23 new bean varieties have been developed through participatory plant breeding over the past 15 years. Some of these are products of landrace crosses, and some have been developed from unreleased formal sector materials. Most are released locally. As well, 9 new maize varieties have been developed, 4 of which have been released nationally. Farmer breeders are frequently seed growers too, and it is the commercial application of farmers' research which really provides the incentive for the participatory research and makes this process sustainable. The other thing that really stands out is the relationship with scientists over this 22-year period. Scientists in the region now regard farmers and the two NGOs as their research partners, totally different from the outset. Farmer researchers evaluate scientists' materials on an ongoing basis, and farmers identify promising materials to scientists for crossing. And this has had a marked impact on scientists' breeding decisions in the region, particularly in Honduras. And a research system has been developed that supports the poorest farmers on hillsides in Honduras. And these are the results of an evaluation that a graduate student of mine, Sebastian Kinsvater, conducted in 2013. And what you're seeing here in the charts in 2 cycles, spring and fall, 2012, the CIALs is the name of the farmer research team. So we looked at the behavior of older CIAL members with 5 or more years of participation, newer CIAL members with less than 5, and then the non-CIAL members. And the blue bars are PPB. And you can see the enormous popularity of PPB materials in the hillsides, even amongst non-farmer researchers, higher than traditional materials, and certainly much higher than conventional materials. And in fact, in the second season in the fall, you can see that the adoption rate of non-participants is almost as high as the farmer researchers themselves. So the impact of these of PPB in the hillsides has been quite profound on farmers' decision making and in fact their well-being too. So finally, what can we learn from this process to support local seed research in Canada? And this is a photograph of actually Rebecca Ivanhoff, who was a student of mine in Honduras, and with farmer Johan Kleinsasser, both seed growers in Ontario who are participating in the Boucher Initiative, showing off their seeding carrots here. And this was a photograph taken by Abir Day from the Boucher Initiative. And what I know is that there's an enormous interest of seed growers here, particularly in Ontario, to connect with the formal sector, as we eventually succeeded in doing in Honduras. And can we move that forward by creating sustainable linkages between local seed growers and scientists in the universities. So that's really what I wanted to talk about today. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Sally, for sharing that with us. We're going to hold questions for the moment and go straight into Matthew's presentation. Matthew Weens lives with his wife and 3 children near Beausejour, Manitoba on Plowshares Community Farm, which they own jointly with 2 other families. Together they keep a small herd of cattle, bilky goats, pigs, bees, and chickens, as well as large garden plots. Matthew has a passion for soil building and tree planting. Matthew also works for Manitoba Agriculture, Food, and Rural Development as a landscape stewardship specialist, where his work focuses on climate change mitigation and adaptation in agriculture. Before working at the province, he spent several years as a research associate in plant science at the University of Manitoba. So welcome, Matthew. Thanks very much for being here.
Thank you, Steph. Can you hear me?
Yes, indeed.
Okay. So I'm located, our farm is located southeast of Beausejour, Manitoba, so that's on the east side of the province, beside the Broken Head River, and that's what drew us out there, the river and the trees, and some fairly nice farmland. Just a quick overview of the climate. Average annual temperature 2.2 Celsius, which maybe doesn't mean that much unless you know what your own particular location is, but nevertheless it's fairly cool. And average annual precipitation 568 millimeters, growing season precipitation 353. So if you know your own, then you can compare, just to say that we're in the wetter half of the province. And frost-free period about 120 days. Last spring frost is May 22nd, thereabouts on average, and then the first fall frost September 19th on average, although it seems like our little farm is maybe in a little frost pocket. We seem to get later spring frosts and earlier fall frosts than everyone around us. But it's not the most limiting factor. The soil, class 3, well, I just checked again, some of it's actually categorized as agriculture capability class 2. If you're familiar with the Canada Ag Capability System, class 1 is the best, and it's pretty rare in Manitoba. There is a bit of class 1 in Manitoba, and then class 2 is fairly common. A little bit of it on our farm, and then class 3 with our particular farm being limited by wetness. The surface is a clay loam, a very nice texture for working. You can get out there right after rain and it's not sticking to your shoes too badly, but just the horizon below that is clay, and so if you get excess moisture, it can fill up the surface and just sit there, and you'd be pretty waterlogged. Management on it's a quarter section, 145 acres. We're growing mostly hay and pasture right now. We've grown grain in the past, but right now the grain is limited to the small plots in the participatory plant breeding program. And then as mentioned, we've got livestock, some small amount of livestock, and then we're doing some market gardening. Mostly we're working together as 3 different families, producing some for sale, but mostly we have focused on kind of a self-sufficiency approach. We're producing a lot of our own food and still, I guess, hoping to develop a commercial venture that brings in enough money that some of us might quit our other jobs. So here's a picture of our farm, the gardens, and then you can see the hayfield in the background and a bit of the landscape. I wanted to talk about seeding of the plots. So I've gone to using this hand seeder, or the push seeder, for seeding the breeders' plots, and I found that that's just the least work. It's you have to prepare the soil quite well in order to use this tool, because too many clods, then you'll plug up the bottom, or you'll get bounced out of your furrow. But it still seems to be quicker than hooking up a tractor and seeder, and the seeder has some other limitations. I just wanted to show that disc there. When I was seeding the wheat, I found none of the discs, the seeder discs, were quite right, so I got a hold of a blank one and drilled holes and then glued on some little cups on there, which you can see some of them have fallen off. But it actually worked quite well, better than some of the other vegetable seed discs. And then now, since I'm just doing oats the last couple of years, I found that the disc for, I think it's jumbo peas, works well for oats. One of the larger discs, I think it's the jumbo pea disc anyway. But wheat was trickier to find one that worked. Here's the other seeder that I've used, and it actually does a really good job of depth and seed placement or rate. I plugged up every second disc and just used about 6 runs or something for each plot. But it's challenging too, because with the small amounts of seed that we're dealing with, the seed cups, they stop metering out. When they still contain seed, but won't meter it out anymore. You need a higher volume of seed than sometimes is available. And then again, it's so wide that you have to really think about how you're going to travel back and forth without driving on your plots and compacting them. So that's why, even though it has good placement, good depth, I went to the hand seeder. And so here's some pictures of the plots, thanks to some of the people who've worked in the program. This is the oats plots in 2012, and I'll move ahead. Here's the same year, the wheat plots, and as you can see, much of the farm is quite nitrogen deficient. I managed to inadvertently find a severely deficient nitrogen deficient area in 2012 for the wheat. It's really sparse, spindly, and so most of the other places aren't quite as bad as this, but nevertheless, the selection pressure I'm putting on, I think, is low nitrogen and fairly high weed pressure. My selection has been restricted pretty much to waiting till the end of the season and going out and picking the biggest heads, the tallest panicles on the oats. I guess I haven't tried too much for disease selection, although fusarium is a problem in some years, definitely a problem in some years. Here's 2013. Anne came out and took some pictures, and so I'm glad I have them available to show. So these are the wheat plots, and here you can see the high weed pressure on our farm that's being managed without any synthetic inputs since 2005. And obviously we have got management and system challenges to work out yet. So that's the wheat there, and here you can see the seed that I've returned back to Anne, and she's planted out at the research farm and under higher fertility, and that's what you can see the potential under higher fertility. And here's back on our farm the oats plots in 2013. And I'll just skip ahead here. Next slide. There's the oats given back to Anna, and she's planted them out. And obviously, I've done some selection because the one variety that came from our farm is the one in the picture here that really sticks out in having a notably erect growth habit, which may not necessarily be desirable, but somehow picking the tallest and the biggest panicles produced from our farm produced unique characteristic. So yeah, I'm not sure why. Anyway, it's interesting. So with that, I'll just want to say a big thank you to everyone involved, all the people involved in the participatory plant breeding program. I wanted to say it's empowering for me to be involved in producing new varieties of wheat and oats, and to realize that it is possible to do something to regain control of our seeds from large companies that seem to want to put profit above the wise use of our crop genetic resources. And so the last point I'll make just there is Open Sesame, the Story of Seeds. I don't know if anyone has seen that movie, but it happened that after this past fall, I got out there after my office job out into the plots, and it was cold and windy and kind of miserable, and I was harvesting the heads and figuring, boy, I don't feel like I'm doing a very good job of this plant breeding, and I'm maybe this is the last year I'll do it. And then I happened to come home, and friends had brought this movie over, and we watched it, and I was convinced that, you know what, this really is valuable, and I don't have any solid reason not to keep going, and I, as I said, I do feel it's very important work. So thanks again.
That's wonderful. Thanks so much, Matthew. It's funny that you mentioned Open Sesame. I've just ordered that DVD, and I'm thinking of screening it at Bear on the Line. So that's great. We have a few minutes for questions. So if you guys have questions for either Sally or Matthew based on their presentation, feel free to type it into the chat pod. I know Matthew has to leave a few minutes early, so we're kind of doing 2 Q&As to take advantage of his presence while we have it. While you guys think of your questions, I have one for Sally, actually. After you kept yourself so tightly to your allotted time, Sally, I kind of want to ask to draw out a little bit more of your knowledge. I'm wondering if, from your work internationally, you can draw any parallels between where the participatory research sector is in Honduras and where it is in Canada, and what you think might be needed here to develop things kind of with the same enthusiasm or to advance them more.
Well, I mean, we've been really fortunate with having a very stable funding environment over a long period of time, which has allowed the participants to develop an enormous capacity for doing this work. You know, on the NGO side, the farmer side, we have farmers that have been participating now, some of them for close to 20 years. I mean, they are true experts in this. And what we've been able to do as individual farmers have really stood out from the others as you know, experts in research and breeding, is that they become farmer facilitators. And this has allowed us to extend the program ever more into more remote areas, because these farmer facilitators who live in remote areas themselves can then connect with farmers that are more remote. And so as a consequence, we've been able to embrace an increasing range of different, you know, agroecologies in the research. And then that information gets channeled back to the NGO and then back to the formal sector. So we have been able to collect an enormous quantity of data, and it's this that have allowed for the release of so many new varieties. It's this system of, you know, networking between farmers and through the farmer facilitators and the NGO to the formal sector, and we don't have that here, I feel. And you know, I think it's a model that we can perhaps aspire to, but it's predicated upon the stability of funding and the stability of participants as a consequence. Well, I don't know if that answers your question, but
yeah, well, it certainly starts to, yeah, and that has developed. You mentioned in your presentation 22 years, but probably even longer than that for the whole sector in Honduras. Would you say?
No. When we started, there was absolutely nothing. I mean, this, as I mentioned very briefly, I mean, we were, people, there was a lot of skepticism of this. I mean, when we started, you saw that first experiment being planting down the hillside. Farmers didn't understand what research was. The scientists were skeptical. They didn't trust farmers doing research. They wanted to do all their research on experiment stations, and that's, of course, why the varieties never worked for the farmers on the hillsides. So we had to break through those barriers of resistance that came both, from the lack of experience on the farmer's side, but the resistance coming from the scientists. And it's the NGOs that have developed this expertise that have been able to sort of straddle the divide between the farmers and the scientists that has been very much, the core of this program.
Very good. A couple of follow-up questions from Jane, and then we have a question for Matthew as well. So, Sally, kind of in the same vein, I guess, what advice do you have for us in about a program to gain broad acceptance and respect for participatory research in Canada? What would be your tip for us?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I sense that the research in the universities is driven by the funding available to researchers, and outside of that, people, at least to my knowledge at Guelph, people aren't doing a lot of this kind of work, and so how we get scientists excited about this, really depends on can we get some funding to continue with this, or will the relationship between researchers and farmers help to drive this on its own? Certainly, I understand that in the States there's a lot more of this connection between farmers and universities in supporting organic seed production. Can we generate this in Canada? I don't know. That's what we have to find out. But I would certainly like to see more of it at my own university. It would be great.
Indeed. Yeah. And on a more logistical note, Jane asks, how do you track the adoption of the PPB varieties that you work with?
So as you saw in that study, I had a graduate student who went out, and we collected he did a randomized study, and it's very complicated. I mean, this was done in about 42 or 3 communities, and some of them very remote, and it's very time consuming. It's quite expensive, and there are a lot of security problems that you're probably aware of in Honduras. So it's not an easy thing to do, but that was what that study sought to do, was to look at, the popularity of these PPB varieties. Are they being used? And you can see from that from the chart, they clearly are being used by hillside farmers because they work. The very, very low adoption rates of materials being produced by the formal sector, whereas the role that farmers play in breeding is critical for farmers, adoption of by local farmers. That needs to be tracked, but there's a cost involved in that too. That was quite a big study that this graduate student of mine carried out. So.
Great, good question, Jane. Thank you. I'm going to switch over to Matt now, who has limited time with us. So Matt, we have a question from Jane, wondering how you found your high weed pressure and low nitrogen kind of realities have been responded to in the PPB program.
Right. Well, I think it might be a little too early to know, except that I'm glad that it's all being looked at, after the 3 years of on-farm selection by people like me. Then it's going back to be compared at the research farm to varieties from other farms, and so their weed pressure is being, or weed competition, I guess, the variety's ability to withstand weeds is being compared. And then, I guess, yeah, have I noticed from one year to the next, like I make selections one year and then that next generation, is it more competitive? No, I haven't noticed one year to the next. Every year I'm choosing a slightly different location on the farm, and the weed pressure is slightly different. So I think it might be a little too early to tell from my farm whether there's already an obvious change. But I'm hoping that, yeah, in comparison to some of the other varieties, that what I'm selecting will show some advantages based on the conditions. That's the whole hope I understand of the program and what I'm striving to contribute to.
Okay, great. There are a couple of other questions coming in. One from Dwayne, directed to Sally. Sally, Dwayne says, is there any form of royalty or other compensation paid to the farmers who have developed the improved varieties? How can they sustain their work in breeding?
Very good question, Dwayne. I mentioned it very quickly in passing, but so the farmers who are most engaged in the PPP work, the research, are also farmers who are producing seed, and they are making money from the sale of seed. So that is partly what is driving their desire to keep on developing new varieties, because there's a commercial application of their research. And so what they're doing right now actually is they are providing seed to farmers, interest-free, and then they're paid for that seed. And the goal is to try and sell as a cooperative with high quality grain seed, and this is the way that they will be recompensed, because farmers will keep coming back to them to buy fresh seed. So that is what is driving the research process.
And as a follow-up, he asks, is PPB seed the same price as other commercial seeds from other sources?
No, and so it's not, because the seed in Honduras has to be released at the national level to be considered commercial seed. So technically, this is sold as high-quality grain. It receives a higher price relative to grain on the local market. So the seed, quote-unquote, producers benefit from getting a higher price than if they were selling grain. But they can't actually sell it at the national level right now as seed. However, the government is changing the seed legislation in Honduras to allow small seed producers who would only have to meet a commercial inspection rather than an on-site inspection, because you can imagine when farmers are producing seed on remote mountainsides, it's never going to get a field inspection. But through the registering of small enterprise, in the future they hope to be able to sell this legitimately as seed, which will allow them to receive a higher price for their product.
Okay. Okay, well, we should move on to Anne's presentation. Sally, do we have you till the end of the webinar, or do you need to leave a little bit early?
Well, I might have to leave a little bit early, and but I can see there's all sorts of questions popping up.
Yeah, we'll do one. We'll do one more, and then just in case we don't have time to ask you at the end. And it is about whether Honduras operates under UPOV, or if there is an IP legislation that they're operating under.
Yeah, they are operating under UPOV to some extent. There are certain things they haven't signed off on, or at least they hadn't done the last time I looked. Basically, they are operating under UPOV, and of course there's a concern always about protecting the farmers' varieties to some degree. When farmers release varieties locally, and because most of the varieties are released locally because they respond to the local agroecology. They are inscribed into the municipal records as a way of demonstrating that this is the product of these farmer breeders, and it's for the use of farmers in hillside farmers like themselves. So that is the only form really of protection that they have. But I should say that farmers derive a lot of prestige from the generation of seeds that are named, after their community or some individual in the community, and that is a very strong incentive for farmers to continue doing this, whether they're receiving the full value of what is seed as opposed to high quality grain. Anyway.
Okay, thank you. Thanks to you both, Sally and Matthew, for your presentations and for all of the information that you've given us. Hopefully you can stick around, but if not, thanks so much for being here. I'm going to move on to make sure that we have enough program at the University of Manitoba and Farms with Her Family in southern Manitoba. She also coordinates the Participatory Plant Breeding Program for the Buddha Family Initiative on Canadian Seed Security. She has previously worked in Saskatchewan doing applied on-farm research and at the University of Manitoba in the Organic Wheat Breeding Program, and is also on the Organic Crop Improvement Association's Research and Education Board of Directors. So welcome back, and this is at least your second, maybe your third webinar with us. Thank you for being here.
Thanks, Beth. So today I'll be giving a Canadian perspective on farmer participation plant breeding. So I should just say that I really enjoyed, Sally, your presentation, and there's a lot of parallels between the breeding program in Honduras and what we're doing in Canada. I think one of the biggest parallels is that the breeding program in Honduras was created to meet a specific need for those farmers that felt like they weren't being represented by the formal breeding sector. And that's the same reason why we started this breeding program in Canada. We're working with organic farmers because traditional breeding programs haven't been targeting organic farmers. And while some of the conventional varieties being released are suitable for organic farming systems, we have done some research where we found that by doing selections and having farmers actually participate in these selections, we can produce varieties that are better suited for organic crop production. So when I'm talking about my presentation, I'm mostly talking about organic crop production, organic farmers participating in this on-farm breeding program. So plant breeding obviously is a very old activity, and it's basically just the purposeful manipulation of plants to create something that humans desire. So selecting, this is an example from corn, so selecting cobs that have a certain color, certain size of kernels, and this has been going on for thousands of years. So farmers were the original plant breeders, and we're trying to incorporate farmers back into the breeding program to have their perspectives heard, and because we think that they have something really valuable to offer, especially when we're working with research scientists. So bringing farmers into a breeding program is really useful. Farmers have been participating in plant breeding for thousands of years, basically by selecting plants with desirable characteristics. And having farmers do the plant breeding meant that crops were very well adapted to specific locations and their farming systems. So with modern plant breeding, it's been very successful at creating high-yielding, disease-resistant crops that are very well suited for conventional agriculture. And this has also resulted in varieties being selected that are broadly adapted, either across the prairies or, say, across a certain province or geographic area. And this is very well suited for environments with minimum stress. So in conventional environments that are made quite similar with herbicides or fertilizers, these broadly adapted varieties work quite well. The problem is when we're working with organic systems, and as Matthew mentioned, his farm might have lower nitrogen and higher weed pressure than where these varieties are being developed, and therefore his farm has some unique needs that maybe aren't being met through the traditional breeding program. So the basic steps in plant breeding, whether it's a farmer or a research scientist embarking on a breeding program, are the same. So you'd start out by determining the breeding goals. So for any program, this could be increasing height in the varieties that are available, improving disease resistance, tolerance to weed competition, or really any characteristics that you're interested in working with. So once you've determined the actual goals of a breeding program, choosing parents would be the next step. And I just brought up a page from the Manitoba Seed Guide for oats. This is an example that this is probably a good place to start, to look at what varieties are locally available or located nationally, see what kind of characteristics they have, and if any of these would make good parents in a breeding program. And once parents have been chosen, then recombining genetics by making a cross between the parents is the next step. And then growing offspring and making selections. This is a picture from a farm in northern Alberta where they've been participating in their organic oat breeding program. You can see their oat lines within this oat field. The farmer is growing them under the same conditions that he would be growing them in the future. And he's basically just looking for plants that suit, that have the characteristics that he's looking for. So whether it's resistance to a certain disease, a certain height, or just general suitability for his farming system. So once selections have been made for a number of years, they're evaluated either on your farm against the traditionally grown varieties. So as a farmer breeder, you could grow your selections and compare them to other varieties that would be available in your area, just to see if your variety performs the same or perhaps better than those currently available varieties. If you're looking for broad adaptation, as a lot of the traditional breeding programs are, or I should, yeah, as long as the formal breeding programs are, they'd be growing these varieties over a large area to see where they're suited to, and looking for something that's suited to a large geographic area. So some of the breeding goals for both organic and conventional farmers would be similar, and some traits would be more important for organic farmers. And these would be the traits that aren't necessarily being looked at in a formal breeding program. So participatory plant breeding, as Sally has described, is a collaboration between the breeding institutions and the farmers. So both of these have advantages. Both the breeding institutions and the farmers have something to bring to the table. So by working together, we're hoping that we can make better gains. And farmer involvement in a participatory breeding program farmers can be involved in many different ways, from something such as setting some of the breeding goals and giving the breeders advice on what the farmers are looking for. They could choose parental lines to use in the breeding program, have trials on their farms. They could participate in the selection, or they could just evaluate the results at the end of each growing season. So there's many different ways that farmers can get involved, either in all of the steps or just a portion that they're interested in. So in organic agriculture, we find participatory plant breeding to be quite useful, and that conducting the selections in the target environment where they're going to be grown will result in varieties developed that have the adaptations necessary to thrive under these organic conditions. So varieties that are able to take up soil nutrients in a different form than if the fertilizer was applied, that are able to compete against weeds, and that has some of the characteristics that those farmers are looking for. And as I mentioned, PPB is important for organic agriculture because the formal breeding programs aren't targeting organic farmers. So the main differences between conventional and the participatory plant breeding program is that the trials are moved from a research station to farmers' fields, and that the decisions are shared between the plant breeders and the farmers. So by moving the trials from a research station to the farmers' field, you can ensure that the characteristics that are important to the farmers are going to be selected. This is just an example of comparing a formal breeding program to a participatory breeding program. So on the left, I have the basic steps of a formal breeding program written out, and you can see that up until the time of actual variety release, the farmers don't have a say in the breeding program. And the farmers' say at the end of the breeding program is whether or not they're going to purchase the variety that's been developed. Within a participatory plant breeding program, there's many opportunities for the farmers to participate. And I just have an example here from our breeding program, the different ways that farmers are and can be involved. So right from selecting parents to making selections on their own farms and having trials to assess the agronomic performance. So there's many reasons why a farmer might want to get involved in a breeding program, and Matthew gave some good examples of why he wanted to become involved. So one of the big reasons is that the available varieties don't perform well on your farm. If the varieties that are currently available, really don't have the yield potential that you would expect, then participating in a program like this might be a good reason to get involved. Or if you're looking for unique characteristics that the formal breeding sector just isn't interested in. So unique quality, taste, color, height, anything like that. If you want to increase the genetic diversity and find a genetically diverse population that might be well suited for a variety of environmental conditions, or just maintaining control over seed and having that seed to develop and increase over the years. So one of the things that I often get asked in this breeding program is how to actually go about making selections as a farmer. So one of the most important things is to make selections under the conditions where you'll be growing the crop in the future. So sometimes people plant these populations in their gardens, and it's really important to actually plant them under field conditions where you have the same weed pressure, same nutrients as you would with your regular crops. And then this is just an example that if your goal is to develop disease-resistant variety, to select seeds from the disease-resistant plants. This is a picture from the oat nursery where some of the farmers were involved in the breeding program since 2011. We had their oats growing. And you can just see the line in the middle that's bent down. That line just didn't have good disease resistance. You basically go through, this would be what the breeders would do, go through and knock over the plants that have poor disease resistance or have a characteristic that you don't like. And the farmers should do the same thing, whether it's pulling the plant out, crimping it over, just so that you don't accidentally choose from a plant that doesn't have the characteristics that you like. I just wanted to give an example of a success story in terms of participatory plant breeding from North America. This is an example of a sweet corn that was developed with a plant breeder and farmers working together to develop a variety that's really well suited for his farm and also has more broad adaptation since it's being sold by high mowing seeds. So if you want to see more information about how that was developed, I think you can go to the High Mowing Seeds website. So I just wanted to talk very briefly about some practical information in the program. This is a picture of the populations that are right before they're sent out to the farmers. So the farmers would receive 3 populations of wheat or oats, and the seed shown in these packages is enough to feed a 20-meter squared area. So this provides enough genetic diversity so that the farmers can, see a range of genetics and make the selections for the plants they like. Matthew talked a bit about seeding. And in terms of selection, negative selection, which is removing the plants with any characteristics that you don't like, occurs throughout the growing season. And positive selection, which is selecting panicles or spikes from the plants that have the characteristics you do like, is conducted at harvest time. So it is important to conduct selection at the appropriate times. So if you're looking for a plant, for example, that is early maturing, something to do would be to go out into the field, when some of your plants are starting to turn brown and some are still green. And if you're looking for an early maturing wheat, for example, what I would suggest is taking scissors and cutting off the most green spikes so that you don't accidentally choose ones that have later maturity later on. And then if you're busy with harvest and other things and you want to come back 2 weeks later and make your final selection, then you're selecting from the earlier maturing spikes. So things to consider when making selections, as I mentioned, things like maturity, height, disease resistance, lodging, and just the general appearance of the spike in the panicle. So thanks for listening, and thank you to all of the farmers and the researchers that are involved in this program.
Awesome. And there's also a paper that's just come out in February about the field performance of these farmer-selected wheat populations. Is there anything that you wanted to say about that?
Sure. So Matthew actually showed some pictures in his presentation of the plots that we had this year. So farmers that were involved in the breeding program since 2011 were all from Manitoba. So after 3 years of selection, we took a portion of their selected seed, planted that at a common experiment at our organic research farm in Manitoba, so that we could compare the farmer-selected populations to each other and to conventionally selected and to the commonly available check varieties. So we did see some really encouraging results there, where the farmer-selected populations on average did tend to be more vigorous. They came out of the ground faster and shaded the ground faster as well. They had about the same level of disease resistance as the commercially available varieties. They matured a bit later and were a bit taller, but on average they had higher yield than the commercially available varieties. And we also assessed the quality characteristics of the farmer-selected populations. And in general, we found that they performed quite similarly in terms of bread-making characteristics to the commercially available varieties. So when Matthew was pointing out in his presentation where he was selecting under a low nitrogen environment, and then he showed a picture of our research farm in Carmen, which does tend to be higher in nitrogen, mainly because of the crop rotation that we use. So we always plant wheat after a green manure crop. Matthew's 2 wheat populations performed really well under our field trial, and we did see that the farmers that had selected under diverse conditions and had selected under high-stress environments such as drought conditions, floods, early frost, low soil fertility, those actually performed really well under our conditions at Carmen last year, which was a pretty average year. So it was really encouraging to see that the farmers were making selections that were really well suited for these organic conditions.
Fantastic. Thank you. And that report is available on our website, and I've just put a link there in the chat pod, so I would invite everyone to check it out. I see a couple of questions are coming our way, which is great. I'm wondering, Sally, since we still have you on the line, if there was anything that you wanted to offer commentary on about Anne's presentation.
Lots of similarities in terms of, selection criteria and the motivation for doing the participatory plant breeding as opposed to doing it on station and so yeah, I mean obviously there's lots of similarities and it's interesting. There was an article that just came out in Nature last May. Arguing that farmers in the north needed to do participatory plant breeding because of the uncertainties of climate change and the need to look to the south where there was much more experience in this than in fact there has been in the north. So it was interesting that coming out in the leading scientific journal that this has been at last recognized, the importance of this work. So yeah, I think we have lots of experience and lots to share. So happy to do that on another occasion as well.
Wonderful, yeah. And if you wanted to send the link along to Jane or myself or both of us, we'd be happy to share that also with participants.
I'll get that for you.
Definitely worth tweeting about.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, let me just take a look. There's several people typing here. So we have a comment from Mark, and I don't know if you saw that, saying he got his seed today. We're still all buried in snow over here.
Thanks, Mark. I'm glad you got the seeds. And yeah, I've been hearing that you guys have quite a bit of snow still in the east. So hoping for some quick melting, I guess.
So a couple of questions, one from David, one from Emily. We'll start with, well, David has asked several questions. You can probably see them there. Some questions about how IP fits into the PPB situation in Canada and who manages that. Also, a question about the dynamic and the leadership in the research between the producers and the researchers. Can you speak to that a little bit, Anne?
Sure. I guess I'll start with the question about the leadership from the researchers. So one of our goals of the project is to try to empower the farmers so that if any of the farmers are interested in making their own crosses or doing some of this work more on their own or with a group of farmers, to try and give them the tools that they need to do that. So I would say that the biggest holdup that I would see in a farmer taking on a breeding program on their own is, it sometimes can be tough to make crosses. A few of the farmers involved in the program have tried to make crosses in the field with varying levels of success. And I've intended to make crosses in the field, but in the summer it's just a bit tough, with the daylight and also just finding time to get out there every morning and make the cross. So it's quite a bit easier to do it inside in a greenhouse. But that said, crossing is something that anyone can learn, and it's very easy. If someone shows you how to do it or you watch some videos online, it can be something that anyone can do on their own farm or at home. And in terms of the IP, so that's a good question. So within this program, we've had some material that's come from Agriculture Canada and some that was developed here at the U of M, like the actual crosses were made at Ag Canada and at the U of M. With Ag Canada, which was the original material, they drew up a document with their intellectual property people sort of outlining what would happen if a variety was to be released from the PPB program. And they basically looked at what percentage of the work was done by the breeder and what percentage was done by the farmer in terms of time. And they drew up sort of a royalty document that if a variety was to be released, this percent of the royalties would go towards the farmer because they've invested, obviously the farmer has invested time and energy into this as well as the researchers. So in that case, if it is jointly developed by the researchers and the farmers, there would be some sort of royalty sharing involved, which seems, at the time the breeder involved and the farmers were very happy with. When it comes to the U of M, I think it would be probably a similar situation. When it comes to this actual seed, anything that comes out of the program that a farmer is interested in growing on their own, increasing and doing what they want with it, is fine. The only issue is with seed in the program the system that we have in Canada is a farmer couldn't sell that as seed because it's not a registered variety. If they were interested in developing a registered variety and selling seed and selling into certain markets, then it would be royalty sharing and how to develop that would have to be discussed at that point. But there is no problem with the farmer, growing the seed, increasing it, and using it for their own purposes or sharing it with neighbors. It just couldn't be sold to someone as seed.
Okay, great. That's really good information for people to have and very clear. A question from Emily asking about networks of PPB projects in Canada. Do you know of others, Anne?
I don't know of others. Yeah, that's a good question. It'd be great to have more of a network of PPB projects in Canada. But really, when I think about networks of PPB projects, I think more about the Northern Plains Sustainable Agriculture Society Farmer Breeding Program. They have a network. This is in the Northern Plains of the U.S. And then also the Organic Seed Alliance does seem to have a network of PPB projects. But in Canada, I can't think of any. I don't think there is a network here.
You mentioned OSA, and what was the first group you mentioned?
The Northern Plains Sustainable Agriculture Society Farmer Breeder Club. And that's based out of North Dakota.
Okay.
And they have, they work on a whole variety of crops like potatoes, corn, some smaller grains, like they work with einkorn, emmer, spelt, wheat, a whole bunch of crops. So they have a really interesting program there.
That's great. I'm going to, obviously we know where to find the OSA. I'll kind of try to track down a link for the other group, and I'll send it out as a follow-up to participants. That sounds interesting. Okay, great. Well, that takes us to about 5 o'clock, and that's the time that we reserved for today's webinar. So I want to thank Sally and Anne, who are still on the line, for giving us their time today. Those are really wonderful presentations and really great information, so thank you so much. Our next webinar will be called Exploring Participatory Research Part 2, Variety Trialing and Record Keeping. So that's the second half of this webinar, and it's happening May 13th at 4 p.m. Eastern Time. Details will be available soon at seedsecurity.ca. So thanks again, everyone, and we'll talk to you next time.